Alright, what is up guys? So I'm here with another non-Zoids mecha review this time around. This time we're going to be looking at the Bandai high-grade Gipsy Avenger from Pacific Rim Uprising. So this essentially is a Gunpla, but it's a Pacific Rim Jaeger as opposed to a Gundam. And I made a throwaway joke back when I did the Kotobukiya HMM Zoids Liger Zero Jaeger review, where I showed this box and I was like, oh yeah, it's time for the Jaeger review. And I said we would do a video on this eventually. So we're actually doing it. I was completely serious when I said that. So this was obviously a product tie-in for the sequel to Pacific Rim. For those of you who are not familiar with it, Pacific Rim was a movie that was a huge breath of fresh air for people that were fans of either the giant monster movie, kaiju movies, or mecha anime, because it was a Hollywood movie with Hollywood production quality, directed by Guillermo del Toro, that came out in 2013. And if you were sick of 4 straight movies of Michael Bay's Transformers at this point, it was such a breath of fresh air to have a movie with high production quality, great cinematography and shot composition that showed the enormity of these mechs and the monsters they were fighting, with the scale and the sort of, like I said, the choreography and motion that you expect out of the genre, not to mention stakes that were unbelievably dire and critical, to the point where the tension was high in the entire film. And it got a lot of great reception from critics and audiences for being such a surprisingly good movie in a genre kind of overrun with bad schlock at the time. And it had a pretty good cast with, was it Charlie Hunnam and Idris Elba. Ron Perlman makes an appearance in the film, as well as Charlie Day. Just overall fantastic movie. And it did get a sequel. There was a lot of, I guess, production difficulties with the sequel, because it didn't come out until a full 5 years later, after there were rumors around the internet and lots of teasers for Pacific Rim 2, and we finally got the trailer for Pacific Rim Uprising, which would take place 20 years after the events of the first movie and star John Boyega as Idris Elba's character's son, who would take up the mantle and pilot this new mech here, the Gipsy Avenger, which was sort of designed to be a emblematic symbol of freedom in the peace times following the events of the first movie, considering that the kaiju threat had been eliminated. But it gave mankind the opportunity to sort of reinforce their supply of Jaeger mechs in the event that some other catastrophic event or kaiju invasion were to happen, because now they had the opportunity of a peacetime to actually build up their resources and construct more mechs. So you have quite a few more Jaegers in operation at the time of Pacific Rim Uprising, and you see a lot of Jaegers in use for utilitarian reasons. But again, the Gipsy Avenger was based off the design of the Gipsy Danger, and again was just sort of seen as a symbol of freedom, this monolith to peacetime, as it were, because the Gipsy Danger was so influential in liberating us from the kaiju threat in the first movie. So beyond that, there's not really a whole lot in terms of lore related to this thing. I was expecting there was going to be a lot more, considering that people were actually very critical of the sequel to Pacific Rim for not having the high stakes that the first movie had, but also trying too hard to make Pacific Rim into a quote-unquote cinematic universe with lore and all these other extended nonsense. And I was expecting there would be a bunch of like side material and novels and all the stuff that would go into the construction and how the technology works behind the Gipsy Avenger and the other Jaegers in Uprising, purely for marketing and being able to squeeze as much content from the IP as possible. But in reality, that wasn't really the case. There's not really a whole lot of lore regarding Pacific Rim Uprising. There was a Pacific Rim animated series made a couple years later as well. But other than that, there hasn't really been too much in the way of novels or video games or any other side series that have really expounded upon the lore of these characters, which is interesting. So we can kind of talk about the Gipsy Avenger in terms of its capabilities. So I don't remember if the Gipsy Avenger is still nuclear powered like the Gipsy Danger was, but it has a more streamlined and slimmed down design compared to the Gipsy Danger, and is capable of a lot more dynamic and agile movement as a result. But it's equipped with a variety of weapons, including the plasma cannon we see there on the box art, and the chain sword, which it has equipped here on the figure itself and on the box art as well. And the model kit does include a variety of interchangeable hands that it can swap between, and it includes those weapons as well. So we could have the plasma cannon and a couple other things equipped if we chose to go that route. So it does have quite a few accessories that come with it, which is pretty cool. In terms of the model kit itself, again, this is a Bandai high grade, so this is the equivalent of a high grade Gundam. And I don't really like high grades. The other high grade that I bought was my very first Gundam that I built, the Gundam Exia from 00. And I, of course, being a novice model builder at the time, didn't put it together very well. And it has quite a few flaws with it, but high grades are typically pretty cheap. You can get a high grade for like $15 a lot of times. And so that was a good, learning kit, sort of a burner kit. But when I saw that they were doing Pacific Rim Jaegers in a high grade, I wasn't upset that they were high grade, because I figured they would go the route they did with Evangelion and say, okay, these are going to be relative to their proportion in the continuity that the mech comes from. And so the Evangelion Unit 1 that I have that's a Bandai high grade is much, much taller. It's like 8 or 9 inches tall and just towers over a high grade Gundam because of its scale in its lore, and how tall it would be relative to its pilot. That is not the case with these Pacific Rim Uprising high grade Jaegers. They actually have scaled these down quite a bit, so these are actually very, very small. I'll do I'll do one or two size comparisons at the end, but these are quite small little model kits. So I was a little bit disappointed by that. I was expecting them to be quite a bit bigger. They would still have a very simple build complexity as far as putting it together, because it is a high grade. But I was expecting it to just have bigger pieces and be taller, which is kind of a shame. So it doesn't really scale well next to any other Pacific Rim kits, and it doesn't scale well next to any Gunpla kits. They scale well next to each other, but that's about it. So that's definitely a downside that I feel with these kits, and one of the reasons why I was a little bit disappointed by it. But on the plus side, the build construction and the actual design of this kit is pretty awesome. So it has sort of this, very similar to a lot of Gunpla, but in a almost better way. It has this sort of exoskeleton on the underside of it, and the blue armor is sort of just added on top of that as accent pieces. The color scheme is also really nice. The molded in plastic of the blue actually does allow for a lot of details to pop pretty nicely, and the articulation of this guy is pretty fantastic as well. I love the gold metallic for the visor and the translucent orange for the core there, and the weapons are all kind of just a generic gray molded plastic. That would look a lot better with some paint applications, but as it is, not a bad looking figure, and the articulation is pretty stellar as well. There's a lot of points of movement on it. Of course, I kind of have his chain sword arm sort of articulated up in order to kind of prevent the weight from coming too far forward and knocking him over. There are a couple more to kind of talk about the history of other Pacific Rim model kits and figures and merchandise and that kind of thing. So for Pacific Rim 1, there was a couple of figures, action figures made by NECA, and I have one here for a size comparison. I actually have the Gipsy Danger, and you can see the NECA Gipsy Danger is quite a bit taller. It stands about 8 inches tall, and I was hoping these model kits would be at least comparable to this, and you can see just how much smaller they are. These are pretty nice in terms of detail, and they're nice and rugged and quite sturdy, but they do lack in articulation, and there's not a whole lot of features and stuff you can do with it. This Gipsy Danger does have a lot of nice weathering on the paint there, but it doesn't have any cool weapons or the chainsaw or anything like that it comes with, so it's not too impressive of a figure. But there was also the Cherno Alpha and the Striker Eureka, which I also have the Striker Eureka, for Pacific Rim Uprising. No, I'm sorry, there actually is one other product line. So there was a series of model kits for the Okay, let me back up for a second. There was even larger figures for Pacific Rim 1 that stood about 14 inches tall, and those were quite a bit more expensive and hard to find, but I've seen a couple of those in person before. My friend Jesse has the Gypsy Danger one, and I've seen a Striker Eureka one in person. They're very, very large, but they were a little bit more sought after by collectors for that reason. And then finally, for Pacific Rim 1, there actually was some large scale model kits that were exclusive to Japan. They were very hard to come by and very difficult to import. And as far as I recall, they were actually made by Kotobukiya. I'll have to do my research on that again because I would love to track some of those down. And the only one of those I've actually seen in person was my friend managed to pick up the Cherno Alpha one when he was actually in Japan, which is pretty cool. For Pacific Rim Uprising, we got another wave of NECA figures like this, and they kind of sat on store shelves, unfortunately, and not a whole lot of people bought them. So in my local area at Steel Collectibles, which is one of my favorite places to go to, and actually shout out to Steel Collectibles for selling me another one of these kits we'll talk about momentarily, but they have a lot of the NECA Pacific Rim Uprising Jaeger figures still in box, and eventually I will get them because the main lineup of Jaegers for Pacific Rim Uprising are all so cool looking. Like the Saber Athena, the Bracer Phoenix, they are all just cool as hell looking mecha, so I really can't complain about that too much at all. So we had that product line, the NECA figures that are just articulated action figures, and then we have, of course, the Bandai high-grade model kits for the Pacific Rim Uprising. And the only ones that I know for a fact they made is the Gipsy Avenger, which we have right here. They made Obsidian Fury, and they made Bracer Phoenix. And I also have the Bracer Phoenix one. Shout out to Steel Collectibles for selling me that one. And these are actually, they're not super easy to come by, but they're also not terribly expensive. They're about $25. And so for that cost, I guess I do kind of recommend them because they're pretty much the nicest Pacific Rim Uprising figures you're going to get. And the reason why I didn't get more of the NECA articulated figures for Pacific Rim Uprising is I was hoping they were going to do the entire line of characters from Uprising in the model kit so I could collect them and they would all be the same scale. But unfortunately, as of right now, it looks like they only made those three, the Obsidian Fury and the Bracer Phoenix being the other two. And I don't like the design of Obsidian Fury. I think it looks really silly. So I'm going to skip that one and just build my Bracer Phoenix. It's also in the backlog, which I will do the review of whenever that's done. So I think with that said, that's pretty much all I have to say about the little Gypsy Avenger here. I do recommend these guys. They're not, again, the easiest to find, but they are pretty inexpensive. And I just think they're neat. I wasn't super harsh on Pacific Rim Uprising like a lot of people I knew were. I think a lot of people found it to be too silly, and that their suspension of disbelief was exaggerated a little bit too far compared to the first movie. It didn't have the high stakes that the first movie did. But from a mecha standpoint, I think all the designs were super, super cool. So kudos to the design team there for that one. So anyway, that's about it for this. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.